In this chapter, we'll take a look at a very powerful component in the Kendo UI library called Chart. This highly configurable and dynamic component makes data visualization a snap. But because it is so powerful, there are many features and configuration options to consider. We'll start off by taking a look at the anatomy of a Kendo chart, then we'll dive right in and add a chart to the RPS dashboard as per the new requirements for visualization. We'll configure the chart from its simplest form to more complex dynamic configuration options with inline components and directives. The Kendo chart is highly configurable and highly customizable. While all the configuration options are available in the docs website, let's take a look at some of the major ones now, and then the ones we'll be using in our project. When you go to the components documentation, under charts, you'll see the different types of charts available as part of the charts package that we're going to install. You have your chart, a sparkline, which is an inline element, a stock chart, and a Sankey. In this chapter, we're looking at the chart element. A chart itself has many different parts. The base element is the Kendo chart itself. If we take a look at the source code of this example, you'll see that that's the root element. A Kendo chart element can define all the different properties right in line, and you can get a fully functional chart just by using this one element. But sometimes you need a little bit more control. So inside of every Kendo chart, you have the ability to add inner elements that control different aspects of the chart. And it looks like this. Inside the Kendo chart, we would just drop in a title element. We can give it text. We can control its look and feel as well. A very important element is the series element. This is the part that actually controls the data itself. And series can have many different types of charts. A series can be specified as a bullet chart, a pie chart, a column and bar chart. We're going to be looking at an example of one of these in this chapter. Let's take a look at a bubble chart. This is what a bubble chart would look like. Think of series as the actual array of data that you're going to be plotting along the X and Y axis. And there can be multiple series on each chart. If you take a look at the area type series, here's an example of multiple series. They're all on this one chart, and there's 3 defined series in this one. A Kendo chart series item is an element that defines one of these series, and it can define the color, the type of graphical representation, such as column or line, spacing, and other properties. Along the bottom in this example, you see months listed. These are the chart categories. Categories can be anything. It's whatever is running along the x-axis. However, if categories are detected to be date objects, those are treated specially by the Kendo chart, and dates are arranged chronologically and automatically. This is exactly what we'll be doing in this chapter, so you'll see a good example of this. And that's a brief introduction to the anatomy of a chart. It's better to learn this by doing, so let's add a chart to our RPS application and implement it. Let's move on to getting the chart module installed and adding it to our application. On the dashboard page of our application, we have this active issues section, and I've added this all issues area for the chart down here at the bottom. Let's take a look at the code, and the chart is going to go right down here in the diagram and statistics area, and we have a little placeholder for chart. But before we do that, let's head out to the terminal. I'm going to Control-C to close out my running application. Let's head out to the documentation, components, charts. We'll see what's involved in the installation. Of course, we're using the CLI approach, so for us, it's going to be pretty easy. We're just going to go ahead and copy this line of code and run it. If you take a look at the manual setup for this, it's a little more involved. We have a few different NPM packages to install, and we also have a lot of dependencies. Let's go out to the terminal. I'm going to paste that command and hit enter to install it. After my package installs, I'm going to start up my server using the ngserve command. And that completes the setup for charts. We're going to be adding the chart to our dashboard page, so make sure your dashboard page.component.html file is open. Let's take a look at the code for this component as well, as we're going to need to import the statistics that we're going to be using for the dashboard, but our dashboard page component is not yet set up to consume that data. Let's create a new property here that's going to contain all the issues that we're going to download based on the filter settings from the API. Public issues all $, that's going to be the stream of issues. It's going to be a behavior subject of the type filtered issues. Let's go ahead and instantiate the new behavior subject. And I want my filtered issues to look like this. First, we're going to have categories. Categories are going to be used in the chart for the Kendo chart category access, and the items themselves, which are going to be used as part of the series. So these are going to be instantiated as empty arrays first. Let's add this filtered issues interface. Let's take a look at where we have dashboard filter, and that's in our shared models. We're going to add another file here called filtered issues to contain our filtered issues. So we're going to have the categories access, which are going to be dates, and items are going to be items for month type. There's the interface for items for month. I'm going to import PT item, and items for month is going to have two types of items, closed and open. These are the plot points that we're going to be doing. So we're going to have two different series in our chart. We're going to show the open items alongside the closed items. And we're going to do this for each of the months that we're going to display. You can think of this as simply the model for our chart. Now that we have that written out, we can import filtered issues into our component. And there we go. Let's head down to ng on init. And right before we refresh, we want to subscribe to our issues all, which is going to return to us issues of type filtered issues. So locally, we're going to need to store a couple of things. We want to store the closed items, we want to store the open items, and we want to store the categories. These are going to be the data binding points for the chart. So let's go back up here, and I'm going to create public categories. This is going to be a date array, and it's going to be initialized to empty array. Now remember that the Kendo chart is smart enough to realize it's dealing with date objects for the categories, and it's going to treat date objects differently by equally distributing them on the bottom axis. And here we have the items open by month. This is going to give us the count for the items that were opened during a certain month. And we're going to have the same thing for the closed items. Now, when we get the data back after we subscribe to issues all, we want to set the local categories to issues.categories. But when these are returned to us from the API, they're going to be strings. So we want to go ahead and convert them to dates by mapping over each item and just instantiating a new date object from each one. Make sure you do this because otherwise the plotting for the dates will be incorrect. We first want to reset our arrays to empty arrays, and then we want to iterate through each of the items. We want to add the number of open items to the items open by month array, and we want to add the number of closed items to the items closed by month array. And that's what our subscription will look like. Now, the first time we call refresh, we currently have one subscription, and that's to get the status counts. That's the numbers we're already displaying, but we're not displaying any data for filtered issues yet, nor are we calling the dashboard service that gets those. So let's use the dashboard service, and we're going to get filtered issues. We're going to pass in the existing filter and subscribe to the results, which is going to be filtered issue type. So we already have the issues all observable here. We're going to call next on it and pass in the result. Great. Now all we need to do is just add the getFilteredIssues method to our dashboard service. I'm going to open up dashboard service. Right down at the bottom here, I'm going to paste in the getFilteredIssues method and do the imports. This method calls the repo getFilteredIssues. So let's go to the repository. Down at the bottom, I'm going to add the getFilteredIssues method here. And we need the getFilteredIssues URL private method as well. Let's add that here. Great. So now our repository is done. Our backend has been done already. Our service is done and the component is done, but not quite. We need to still add the Kendo chart. Let's save everything. And I'm going to start out with adding the chart right here in the next lesson. We have our data being delivered to this component. Let's use it now to create the simplest chart that we can. And then we're going to modify some of the properties and some of the chart internals to modify the way the chart behaves and looks. The basic component we can add here is the Kendo chart component. So we're going to do that. And then back in the code, we're going to do our import. And that's Kendo chart, which is coming from Progress Kendo Angular charts. And let's include that in our component imports before we forget. However, this is not going to render anything because we need to define a couple of things that are mandatory. The first mandatory attribute we need to bind is the series attribute. You can define series inline as part of your Kendo chart attribute set, just like this. We'll do it a different way a little bit later to be more declarative, but you could do it this way to make it simple, and if you don't need a lot of configuration. The way we bind this is to give it an array, because series is an array of different series items. One series item can have a data attribute that's bound. And let's go ahead and bind the items opened by month. If we take a look at this chart, you'll see that we are already getting data back. It's calculating the x-axis dynamically, and by default, it's rendering an SVG. The other option is to render as a canvas, and you can change that by specifying how you want it rendered. I'm going to stick with the default SVG, as that's supported by most modern browsers at this point. Notice how we don't have a title, we just have our H3. We also don't have the category axis labeled. Let's see if our filtering works. I'm going to tap on 3 months, and yes, it looks like it's working just fine. In fact, if you notice, I'm going to tap on one of these filter buttons here, and we have 6 items for the 6 months, 3 items for the 3-month button, and 12 items for the 1-year button. That means that this chart is actually interpreting our dates and automatically organizing them by categories. How do we show the categories down here? Well, we already have the categories list in our code. If we take a look here, you'll see that we have a property called categories, and that's a data array that we populate, so we can use that. In our Kendo chart, I can data bind a property called category access, and I can set that to be an object that has the categories property, and I can bind that to our categories property. Let's take a look. Okay. There's a lot of automation going on behind the scenes. All we specified was just look at these categories and look at this data, and Kendo chart automatically figures out what we wanted. So at the bottom of this chart, we see that each month is displayed and it's abbreviated, and there's a 12-month period that's displayed. If we tap on 6 months, you'll see that we have 6 months of data. Now, each series that we're displaying can also specify the type of chart that we want to use. So for example, let's say we wanted to use a line chart instead of a bar chart. We can specify that right here. So I can just add type line, and the chart will be rendered as a line chart. If I had more series, which I do, I can add them all in line right here, but it's going to get pretty messy, isn't it? So in the next lesson, let's take a look at how we can split up the series and define them declaratively as sub-elements of the Kendo chart. In the previous lesson, we've added a simple line chart to our dashboard. We need to display a little bit more data though. We want to display closed items and open items here. And while we could do that right in line in our Kendo chart element, it's going to get a little bit messy if we want to have more series in here. So let's split this up and add a subcomponent for series. I'm going to delete the series binding for the series attribute here. And inside of our Kendo chart, I'm going to add an element called Kendo chart series. This element groups Kendo chart series items, multiple ones if we need it. Let's start with one. So we're going to have Kendo chart series item, and this will bind a data attribute to the items open by month, kind of like we had before. We can even add a type here called line, and this should render just like we did a minute ago. And there we go. There's our line chart, but now our series item looks much cleaner because it's in its own element. And now we can freely add another series item, which is going to represent our closed items. So I'm going to copy this one and paste another one down here, this time binding to the items closed by month. Let's take a look. There we go. We have 2 lines here. One is for the closed items and one is for the open items. Now, instead of having to define the type and some other elements for each one of these series items, there's a special subcomponent for the Kendo chart that we can use to define some defaults. I'm going to remove this type equals line right here, and by default, our series are rendered as bar charts. Let's take a look. There we go. We have the bars, and we can define an element called Kendo chart series defaults here. which will apply to all the series that are defined. And here I can define type line. So if I ever need to change the type of chart that I'm showing, I can do it in one place. And there it is. Now the type of chart that I want to display is a column chart. So let's go back to column. And I can also specify something called a gap. So I'm going to data bind gap to 0.06, which means I want the bars to be a little bit wider and the space between the bars to be smaller. And there we go. It's also very hard to see the data this way, and it doesn't look very pretty. So there's another option that I'm going to set for all the series, and that's called the stack. I'm going to bind that to true, which means it's going to stack all the series on top of one another. This is what it looks like. So now our open items are on the bottom, and our closed items are up on top. Or are they? Well, I'm not quite sure because the colors don't really match. So how do we get the colors to match? Well, we can adjust the colors for each one of the series. Let's go do that. For the first series items, where we're showing them open by month, I can bind the color property here, and I can give this a hex value. Let's say CC3458. And for the closed items, I'm going to bind the color as well. Let's give this the value 35C473. I also want these bars to be slightly see-through. So I'm going to change the opacity of each one of these. I'm going to set it to 0.7. Let's take a look. And there we go. The green series in the chart match the closed item's color. This is a visual representation after all, so we should be able to easily identify colors. Our chart is looking pretty good already. But what if we wanted to configure it a little bit more, specifically around the category axis? Right now, our categories are just bound inline in the Kendo chart element. Well, the Kendo chart specifies another element that we can use to fine-tune the category axis. I'm going to remove this category axis binding from the Kendo chart, and instead, I'm going to add a Kendo chart category axis sub-element. This can actually contain multiple category axis items. So let's define one of them, Kendo chart category axis item. And this item can have a categories attribute that we can data bind to our categories property in the component. I'm going to save this, and this should look pretty much just like we had before. One thing I want to do is get rid of these grid lines, and there is definitely a tweak for that. For each category item, I can specify an attribute called major grid lines. We can say visible equals false on this, and this will hide the grid lines. Let's take a look. Not only the horizontal lines are visible, but not the grid lines for the categories. Also, the categories are a little bit too close to the chart. I want them a little bit lower. We can style that. Let's bind an attribute called labels. Here we can specify the rotation. Let's say we want it at 30 degrees, and we can specify the margin. Let's say we want it to be a little bit lower, so I'm going to leave a space of 20 pixels up above. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, there we go. On second thought, I think we are going to have enough space, and we don't need to have these dates slanted. So instead of rotation being 30, I'm going to set the rotation to be auto. Auto is useful for a number of things. If the number of categories becomes too much and won't fit horizontally, the chart will automatically set them to vertical. So right now we do have enough space and the chart is showing these horizontally, but there is another setting we can change. Let me go up here and bind something called base unit. Base unit tells the chart what you want to use for the dates categories. Do you want to use weeks, months, or days? So it's currently using months as the base unit. And you can see that each one of these categories is a month. But we can also specify weeks here. And now you can see two things. One is the weeks are displayed down at the bottom. And two is the labels are displayed vertically, not horizontally. That's rotation being auto. So if I set this to 3 months, you'll see that the rotation is back to horizontal because we have enough space. 6 months, there's our week displays. And 1 year, the weeks become too much, so they become vertical. I like the way months look for this particular chart, so I'm going to switch this back to months. And there we go. There are many other things you can do with a chart and many other types of charts that you can try, including pie chart, bubble chart, stock chart, spark lines. Let's quickly take a look at the pie type of chart. I doubt the usefulness of this type of chart, but sometimes it looks nice on demos. There's our pie chart, and if I can filter this further, you can see the pie chart animate in a nice fashion. I'm going to set this back to column. But this gives you an idea of how easily you can switch around and play around with different visuals with the Kendo chart.